But first, as I said, great to be back with you in what will be a critical year for our country and the wider world. Now, for Australia, of course, it's a federal election year. And while we don't yet know the date, what's clear is that Anthony Albanese and Peta Dutton have both started their campaigns. Barely by mid-January, we had the PM out last week blitzing 3 states, promising, amongst other things, to spend $7 billion on Queensland's Bruce Highway. Although whether the money is available now or only in the forward estimates is far from clear.
Today's announcement of $7.2 billion of additional funding for the Bruce Highway will save lives. It brings the Australian government contribution up to $17 billion.
Yesterday too in Melbourne, the opposition leader, well, it, for all intents and purposes, looked like a campaign launch in a must-win marginal seat in Melbourne.
Mr Albanese says that this election is about the future versus the past. Well, I think the past 3 years are a good indication of what the future will look like under a returned Labor government. And that's a future that Australians can't afford. This year, Australians will have an opportunity to elect a new government and a new strong coalition government to get our country back on track.
Now look, people tell you this election matters, that election matters. Every election matters because the type of government we have impacts on the country we are. But this election matters much more than most because the current government is hell-bent on trying to change our country, shame our country, send it backwards and bankrupt it. Worse than Whitlam is now the refrain, and it's accurate. So how you vote at the looming election matters because more than ever, you will choose Australia's future. Another term of this Prime Minister and we're locked into his trajectory of debt, weakness and woke. Remove him and Australia's got a chance to reset and change course. If the Albanese government hangs on to power and the so-called green transition continues, we will be saddled forever with much higher electricity prices. The rejection of our traditional economic strengths in mining and agriculture because of the supposed damage to the environment, with a much larger and more interfering government running the economy. If the Albanese government hangs on to power, immigration will remain sky high. Wages will stay depressed. Productivity will continue to decline. Housing costs will keep going up. Infrastructure will struggle to cope, and our society, well, it will continue to fracture because fundamentally, the Green left thinks Australia is built on white settler injustice, and the more we change from the Anglo-Celtic, Judeo-Christian people we've been, the better. If the Albanese government hangs on to power, our country will be ever more critical of Israel, to pander to Muslim votes in parts of Western Sydney and Melbourne, and is sure to drift apart from the United States and other allies, if only because all its senior members from the Prime Minister down, including the Foreign Minister Penny Wong, who's off to Washington next week to represent us at the inauguration, have all been ferociously and publicly critical of the incoming President, Donald Trump.
We have an alliance with the US, we've got to deal with him, but that doesn't mean that you're uncritical about it. He scares the shit out of me.
For all the American predisposition for episodic craziness, look at Trump. How did that happen?
It is not anti-Semitic to expect that Israel should comply with international law that applies to all countries.
Since the Albanese government came to office in 2022, they have consistently refrained from any criticism of the Beijing government, even when a Chinese warship deliberately harmed Australian sailors. So much so that the commissars in Beijing now held up our Prime Minister, the handsome boy they call him, as some sort of warped role model for other Western governments, as if weakness is something to be emulated. With the world growing more dangerous by the day, the last thing we need is to weaken our most important partnerships or walk away from trusted allies. But weakness is synonymous with this Prime Minister and his government. And a government that's been weak on the economy, on security and on national unity will only get worse if it's dependent on the Greens post-election. If he has to do a dirty deal to hang on to the top job. Now, I don't say that change of government is going to make everything perfect. There's much that's beyond anyone's control, such as global markets, tensions and wars overseas. And there's much that's hard to change, such as trying to undo Labor's addiction to waste and spending and the left's obsession with climate change. But in all the big issues, the coalition under Peter Dutton has better instincts. At yesterday's launch in Melbourne, in a rare moment, Dutton filled out some of his own personal history.
Many, many years ago, through to university, I, through newspapers, had a lawnmower run. I worked in a butcher shop after school and on Saturdays from grade 7 until I started uni. I have saved diligently over those years, and it allowed me to put together a deposit for a house. And I bought my first home at age 19, one of my proudest achievements.
For a decade, as many of you know, he was a Queensland cop, seeing people at their best and their worst. And that helps to explain his passion to see sex offenders and drug dealers behind bars. While growing up in public housing and then going straight into student and party activism's made Anthony Albanese an advocate for ever bigger government, Dutton did it hardly less tough. It was his experience of having a go in different jobs and ultimately running a small business before going into Parliament. Well, all of that's made him an advocate for bigger citizens, not bigger government.
Australians are best served by smaller government which gets off their back, supports free enterprise and rips up regulation.
Under the coalition, he said, we can expect lower taxes and an end to climate policies that destroy manufacturing jobs and increase our cost of living pressures that are already some of the highest in the OECD. He's backed in his promise made here earlier on our show last year to honour our one national flag with new commitments today on Australia Day.
We are a country united under one flag, and if we're asking people to identify with different flags, no other country does that, and we are dividing our country unnecessarily.
If Peter Dutton gets elected, we can expect lower immigration, more stress on our national unity over our diversity. More focus on what brings us together rather than what makes us different. It's going to be a big year in politics, and it's a year in which your vote will be more important than ever. Now, during The Voice, you'll remember I implored you to speak up. I said if you spoke up, if the silent majority didn't stay silent on this huge constitutional issue, well, others would have the courage to find their voices too. Well, you did that. And look what happened. You made history. And you started to turn the tide in rejecting woke. You started to turn the tide in getting our country back. But let's not get complacent. Let's not think the job's been done. Only a change of government in Canberra will cement those wins. And that's the real fight for 2025, the fight for Australia's future. We did it before with The Voice, and I am absolutely confident we can do it again. But it's only going to happen if you do what you did before, and that's speak up in your business, your community, at the kitchen table, amongst your mates. I mean, this is the best country in the world. And it's our duty this year to keep it that way.